Hello, I'm Gwen Hill from Pine Ridge Baptist Sunday School Department, Ladies Division, and we are beginning our study of Exodus today. We have just completed our study of Genesis. In that study, the last few verses, we saw that Joseph died, and between that verse and today's lesson is approximately 400 years, somewhere between 350 and 400 years forward. So anytime you're reading scripture, be aware of the timeline that you're in, because sometimes if you're not careful, you'll think you're in the same day, week, hour, month, year, and a lot of years have passed. So you have to keep aware of that. In Exodus 1 and 2, it's talking about the redemption of God's people. He's bringing them out of bondage in Exodus. Where the first half we're going to see what God did for them, and the second half of Exodus we're going to see what God said and how they are to show their gratitude to Him for what all He has done for them. We are going to start out talking about the people that were in Egypt. But before we do that, we'll go to Genesis 15:3. This is God speaking to Abram, and it's part of the covenant that He made with them, the promises. There's one thing that God can't do. You know that? God can't tell a lie. So in Genesis 15, He's telling Abram, know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and they will be enslaved and mistreated 400 years. And in verse 14, the end of that verse says, and they will come out. But why would God let His people go into slavery? Why would He allow such a thing to happen? Well, He did it to help them to grow. One, growth is numerically. 70 people can't start a nation. 70 people can't take the land. 70 people can't hold the land. And 70 people couldn't do the land and the people justice. They had to be more people than that. So He pulled them out of Canaan and took them to Egypt, had them go to Egypt for survival. The famine was on, if you'll remember. He had already placed Joseph in authority there. Joseph manipulated them going into Goshen, and there they were almost like they were in a cocoon, because the people in Goshen were allowed to believe however they wanted to believe. And that way the Hebrews could maintain their belief in Holy God, in El Shaddai. They would not be pressured to worship the little gods of Egypt. Egypt had a lot of gods, and that's little g gods. So He kept them there, and He nurtured them there. It's almost like they were in a womb there. They were being taken care of. The chapter outlines that I'm going to use, well, I don't use it, the Bible uses it. Chapter outlines 1 through 7 is all about Moses. Chapters 8 through 13 is about the plagues. 14 through 18 is the actual leaving of Egypt. The 19 through 24 is the law. And 25 through 40 is the tabernacle and worship there. So we're going to begin in Exodus 1 through 7. Now are the names of the children of Israel who came to Egypt. Each man in his household came with Jacob: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin; Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. All those who were descendants of Jacob were 70 persons, for Joseph was in Egypt already, and Joseph died, all of his brothers, and all of that generation. But the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly, multiplied and grew exceedingly mighty, and the land was filled with them. I've told my Sunday school class before, anytime the Bible in a sentence structure tells you something twice, pay attention. It's important. Each word in the Bible is important, but when they tell you twice, remember in the New Testament when the Lord would say, verily, verily, I say unto you, He's saying, pay attention. What I am saying to you is very important. I intend for you to get it. Now listen up. Well, Let's go back and read verse 7 again so that you can get an idea of how quickly this population is growing, this Hebrew children population. Verse 7, but the children of Israel were fruitful, increased abundantly, multiplied, and grew exceedingly mighty, and the land was filled with them. You don't think that's a population explosion? Yes, it was. And you know what? God wasn't the only one that noticed. In Exodus 1, 8 through 11, now there arose a new king over Egypt who didn't know Joseph. And he said to his people, look, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply and it happen in the event of a war, that they also join our enemies and fight against us, and so go up out of the land. He says, he's talking to his cabinet, and he says, hey guys, have you noticed we've got a problem here? They outnumber us. According to everything I've read, you had one Egyptian and you had two immigrants. So out of 3 people, only one was Egyptian, the other 2 were immigrants. And he is seeing a real problem. Should there be a war? Should they be invaded? They didn't want these immigrants to join the invading force. It was a real danger, and he recognized it. It's his job, the security of his nation, and he sees this as a problem. I don't think he thought about it a whole lot, because shepherds are not usually great warriors. David was, I know, but on the whole, they were not. Verse 11, therefore, his plan, his number one plan to stop this exponential growth in population was, therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with their burdens. And they built for Pharaoh supply cities, Pithom and Ramesses. I don't know how they did it. The Bible doesn't really explicitly go into how they did it, but he enslaves these people. He goes in and demands workforce for them. Remember, they don't own the land. They're there at the largest of the Pharaoh. And he says, if you're going to stay here, you're going to have to do this. You're going to have to do that. You're going to have to become a labor force for me. In verse 12, 13, and 14. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew. And the Egyptians were in dread of the children of Israel. So the Egyptians made the children of Israel serve with rigor, and they made their lives bitter with hard bondage, in mortar, in brick, and in all manner of service in the field. All their service in which they made them serve was with rigor. This paranoia of the Pharaoh spread to all of the people, and everybody began to, where all the Egyptians feared the children of Israel. They saw the threat. They had great apprehension. And they began to be extremely thorough, strict, and exhaustive and strident in the way that they treated these Hebrew people. If you think of a 12-hour day as being a long day to have to work, increase that maybe to an 18-hour day. They were already working from sunrise to sunset, but he extended that. His whole goal was he wanted these men so tired, so worn out, that when they went home, all they did was get a bite to eat and went to sleep. He wanted no more procreation of children, and he thought if he made them tired enough, if he overworked them enough, that would come about. But in verse 15, we find out that it wasn't working. The population growth was continuing. And verse 15, then the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, of whom the name of one was Shiphrah, and the name of the other was Puah. Now, Shiphrah means beautiful in Hebrew. and Pua means splendid. Isn't that neat? And he said, when you do the duties of a midwife for the Hebrew women, and you see them on the birth stools, if it is a son, then you shall kill him, and if it's a daughter, then she shall live. Let's talk about this just a minute. In that culture, to be a midwife, the ones that they selected the most to be a midwife was a lady who had no children of her own. She didn't have the call of taking care of her own children. She would be more available to the general public should she be needed. These two women would not have found themselves normally in front of a Pharaoh. This would have been terrifying for them. They have probably seen the men stumbling and trudging back home with lash marks on their backs. They have seen them caked in mud. They have seen them absolutely exhausted. And they knew the stories, and they probably have seen firsthand of the mistreatment that the Hebrews were receiving. And to go and be called in front of a Pharaoh would have been a very fearful thing. Plus, it would have been very fearful because of all the splendor the Pharaoh would have had exuded in his court to these two slave women. I can see them with their heads bowed as they came into his presence. And that's probably a really good thing when they heard him give the instructions that he gave. When you're going to attend to a Hebrew woman in labor, I want you to kill all the boy children and let the girl children live. All males are to be destroyed. I used to be a nurse. I was not a maternity nurse. I did not have anything to do with pregnancy. Early in my career, I worked for 3 days in OB, and that was enough for me. But that's very true. You can kill a baby very easy, and especially if you were as skilled as these women were skilled. And his way, the Pharaoh's way of lowering the population hadn't worked with just overworking the men. He's going into another phase. He's going a little stronger. He's going to stop the procreation at the beginning to get rid of the men. One of the ladies in my Sunday school class said, well, I would have taken the girl children, not the men. Why did he take it's the girls that have the babies? I said, yeah, but one man can impregnate 50 women. And men are more of a danger when they're grown up than a woman is in this culture. So these two women have received a message that absolutely would have terrified them. And the birthstones he's talking about was hewn out rocks that were specifically shaped in a position that a woman could recline on that rock, and it would be a good position for her to use when she was birthing her child. So that's what he's talking about in there. In verse 17 through 19, but the midwives feared God. What a wonderful phrase. Wouldn't that be a wonderful thing to have written in the Bible about us? How honored these midwives were, that we not only have their name, but we have this phrase written about them. They feared God. And they did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but they saved the male children alive. This is the first instance of civil disobedience that's listed in the Bible. You know, were they to obey God or were they to obey man? Obey the king. Why did Pharaoh not notice their expressions when he told them to kill the children? I think it's because their faces were down. I think this absolutely terrified them. Verse 18, so the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, why have you done this thing and saved the male children alive? Disobeying the Pharaoh could cost you your head. And 19, and the midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are lively and give birth before the midwives come to them. They have gotten together, these two, and they said, we're going to be called on the carpet for this. And we may lose our lives for this. We need to have a response ready for him when he asks us why we're allowing the little boys to live. And they came up with, your Egyptian women are delicate, and they call us early in their labor, and we have plenty of time to get there to help them. But the Hebrew women, they're stronger, they're stouter, they're outdoor people, you know, and they, a lot of times, most of the time, by the time they call us, they've already delivered that child, and there's nothing we can do. You know what this is all about. Satan is using Pharaoh to try to stop the seed of the woman. Exodus 1:20 through 22. Therefore God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very mighty. And so it was, because the midwives feared God, that he provided households for them. Our God has really bless these two women. Remember what I said about the midwives before, that they probably didn't have children of their own, homes of their own? God has rewarded them. They now have homes and children of their own. Pharaoh commanded in verse 22, this is a horrible, horrible thing that the Pharaoh is doing. Remember how I've told you he's built up the Egyptians' paranoia about the Hebrews? Listen to this. My first two plans has not worked with getting the population down. I've worked them and then overworked them, and then I plan to get rid of the little baby boys, but none of that seems to be working. So I've got to enlarge my plan. Listen to verse 22. So Pharaoh commanded all, A-L-L, all his people, saying, every son who is born you shall cast into the river, and every daughter you shall save. He has now just deputized every Egyptian to take it upon themselves. If they see a woman with a baby, if they hear a baby crying, they are to investigate. If it's a little girl, leave them alone. If it's a little boy, take that little boy and throw him in the river. Kill him. Feed him to the alligators. Oh my goodness. He gives every single Egyptian the authority to commit murder. Before we meet next time, read Acts 7, verses 17 through 23. This is Stephen, and he's talking about Moses. It's really a neat thing. Gives you a little bit of heads up about this man we're going to be studying. You know, into this political climate, this young child was born. This little Moses was born, a male Hebrew baby, destined for destruction, yet preserved by a sovereign God to fulfill a promise of deliverance made hundreds of years earlier. I'll see you next week. We'll talk about Exodus 2.